He captured 42 Germans with just a sword. It sounds impossible, something ripped straight from a legend. But this wasn't myth or fiction. This was the story of Jack Churchill, the British officer who walked into the chaos of World War II armed not with a machine gun, but with a longbow, a Scottish broadsword, and a set of bagpipes slung across his shoulder. In a war defined by tanks, bombers, and bullets, he brought a medieval spirit back to the modern battlefield, and somehow, against every odd, he made it work. The men who served beside him thought he was crazy. The Germans who faced him thought he was supernatural. But to Jack Churchill, it was simple. Any officer who goes into action without his sword, he once said, is improperly dressed. And with that code of honor guiding him, he charged headfirst into some of the most dangerous battles of the war. It all began in 1939, when Europe once again plunged into darkness. While others prepared rifles and ammunition, Churchill carefully sharpened his claymore blade, the same kind Scottish warriors had carried centuries before. He polished the brass of his bagpipes, checked the string of his longbow, and looked into the mirror with that wild glint that made him infamous among his men. He wasn't just a soldier, he was a throwback to a forgotten age of courage, and that made him both terrifying and magnetic. When the British Expeditionary Force landed in France, Churchill joined the Manchester Regiment. The smell of mud, gasoline, and smoke hung over everything. German forces were pushing through Belgium with speed and precision, leaving devastation in their path. But while others crouched behind sandbags, Jack stood tall, sword hanging from his belt, bagpipes on his back. At night, his comrades could hear the faint echo of those pipes drifting through the fog, haunting melodies that sent shivers down their spines. It wasn't just music, it was defiance. Then came his first legend. Near the French village of L'Épinette, Churchill spotted a group of German soldiers advancing cautiously along a hedgerow. He raised his longbow, drew it back with perfect form, and released. The arrow sliced through the mist and struck the lead German dead. It was the last recorded longbow kill in modern warfare. For Jack, it wasn't madness, it was instinct, a quiet tribute to the warriors who came before him. But soon the retreat began. The British lines collapsed, and chaos consumed the roads toward Dunkirk. Artillery pounded the coast, trucks burned, soldiers ran for the beaches. In the middle of that storm, Churchill didn't hide. He ran toward the front, sword drawn, shouting orders and rallying men who were on the brink of breaking. His courage was contagious. Even as bombs fell and machine guns tore through the dunes, he stood like a ghost from the past, one man against the tide of history. When he finally boarded one of the last evacuation boats, covered in dirt and sweat, his bagpipes rested on his knees. He played a slow Scottish lament as the ships drifted away from the burning coastline. Men turned to listen, silent, exhausted, broken. For a brief moment, that song drowned out the chaos of war. Most would have gone home after Dunkirk, grateful to be alive. But not Jack Churchill. For him, the fight had just begun. In 1941, he volunteered for the Commandos, Britain's elite raiding force formed to strike deep behind enemy lines. That's where his legend truly exploded. The Commandos trained for surprise attacks, night landings, sabotage, close-quarters combat. Churchill fit in perfectly, though he always stood out. During drills, while others carried knives and pistols, he carried his broadsword, gleaming even under moonlight. He said it reminded him of discipline, of tradition, of the warrior's heart. His first commando operation took him to the coast of Norway in a raid known as Operation Archery. It was freezing cold, the kind of cold that cuts through the skin and numbs the soul. The sea crashed violently against the landing craft as Churchill led his men toward the shore. In the distance, German bunkers flashed with muzzle fire. Most officers would have waited for cover, but Churchill stepped forward, raised his bagpipes, and played March of the Cameron Men. The pipes howled across the wind, and his men followed him, laughing, shouting, charging. That was how he fought wars, with courage loud enough to silence fear. When they hit the beach, Churchill drew his sword and sprinted ahead, cutting through barbed wire and barking commands. The Germans couldn't believe what they were seeing. A man in full combat gear wielding a claymore like it was the 1700s. Within minutes, his squad had taken the position. Several prisoners were captured, their eyes wide in disbelief. Among them, one officer whispered in shock, "Der verrückte Engländer," the crazy Englishman. That nickname stuck. After the raid, Churchill became a living legend among the British troops. His photographs circulated through the ranks, the wild smile, the sword at his side, the pipes on his shoulder. He represented something deeper than bravery. He embodied the idea that courage isn't about logic or survival. It's about belief. In the darkest times, his madness gave others reason to hope. But war, like time, never stopped for long. By 1943, the commandos were striking across the Mediterranean, raiding enemy strongholds under moonlight. In one mission on the Italian coast, Churchill and a handful of men infiltrated a German outpost. When gunfire erupted, he didn't flinch. He drew his sword and charged. Later, reports would say he single-handedly captured 42 Germans that night, forcing them to surrender at sword point. The story spread through the Allied lines like wildfire. Soldiers whispered it around campfires, shaking their heads in disbelief. The man had captured an entire platoon with a blade. When he returned to base, dirt-streaked and grinning, he said only one thing to his commanding officer. "They weren't particularly happy to see me." That was Jack Churchill. Humor sharper than steel, courage louder than the explosions around him. Even his superiors couldn't quite understand him. Some called him reckless, others called him genius. But no one could deny his results. His raids succeeded where others failed. His men followed him because he made them feel invincible. If Mad Jack's leading us, they'd say, "We're going home." As the war raged on, Churchill became both symbol and myth. Newsreels and letters home spoke of the soldier with a sword, half knight, half commando, who refused to surrender the old spirit of battle. To the Germans, he was unpredictable and terrifying. To his own men, he was hope personified. And as 1944 approached, that hope would be tested like never before. The Allies were preparing for their most daring operations yet, and Jack Churchill would be right in the middle of them, still armed with his sword, his bow, and his unshakable madness. The year was 1944, and Europe was trembling under the weight of war. The Allies were pushing back, one brutal step at a time, reclaiming what the Axis had seized. Jack Churchill, with his sword gleaming at his side, was no longer just a soldier. He was a legend walking among mortals. Every man who saw him on the front lines knew they were in the presence of someone different. When most men clung to guns, he clung to history, to honor, to something older and wilder than anyone could explain. He was assigned to lead his men in Yugoslavia, deep behind enemy lines, to support the partisans against German forces. The mission was madness, remote mountain terrain, heavy resistance, minimal support. Exactly the kind of chaos where Jack Churchill thrived. The operation began under the cover of darkness, the cold wind slicing through the hills as their boats landed silently on the Dalmatian coast. His men followed in tense silence, rifles gripped tight. But at the front, Jack's pipes began to play. The ancient notes of "Will You No Come Back Again" floated through the night, haunting and beautiful. For the Germans guarding the shore, it was the sound of ghosts. For his men, it was the sound of home. That song gave them strength to step into hell. When the first shots cracked through the night, Churchill didn't flinch. He ran forward, sword drawn, shouting for his men to follow. The flash of steel under moonlight became their rallying point. They stormed the bunkers, cut through wire, and cleared the trenches. By dawn, the beach was theirs. After the victory, Churchill barely rested. He cleaned his sword, packed his bagpipes, and joined the next phase of the operation, pushing inland, striking deeper into enemy territory. His leadership style was reckless to some, fearless to others. He believed that courage was contagious, that one man's fire could ignite 100 others, and wherever he went, that fire burned bright. In one raid, as dawn broke over the Adriatic, his small team attacked a German position near the town of Brach. The odds were impossible. Dozens of well-armed Germans entrenched on a hill, machine guns ready. Churchill's men hesitated, but he looked back with a grin and said, "Come on, boys, let's give them a proper show." Then he charged uphill, bagpipes wailing, sword flashing, the sound echoing through the valley. The Germans froze for a second, confused, stunned by the sheer audacity. By the time they opened fire, Churchill's team was already on them. It was brutal, close-quarters fighting, bayonets, grenades, fists, steel. But the commandos pushed through, driven by the madness of their leader. They took the hill, raised the British flag, and sent word back to base. The mission was complete. That night, the men gathered around a fire, exhausted and bleeding, while Churchill cleaned his sword again. One of them asked, "Sir, why the sword? Why not a pistol?" He smiled faintly and said, "Because when you fight like a gentleman, you remind the world that war doesn't own your soul." But destiny had other plans for him. Days later, during another raid, the Germans counterattacked with overwhelming force. Mortars and machine gun fire lit up the hillside. Churchill's men were scattered, some killed, some captured. He refused to retreat. He stayed behind, firing his pistol until the last bullet was gone. Then, with nothing left, he stood tall, sword in hand, and played his bagpipes, the melody of "Will You No Come Back Again" echoing through smoke and death. That sound was the last thing his men heard. When German troops surrounded him, they didn't know what to do. The man stood calm, covered in dirt, sword hanging from his hand, the pipes still humming softly. They thought he was insane, and maybe he was, but in that madness, there was power. The German officer in charge ordered him captured, not killed. He said later, "Any man who fights like that deserves to live." Jack Churchill was taken to Sachsenhausen concentration camp, one of the Nazis' most notorious prisons near Berlin. There, behind the barbed wire and guard towers, the man who once stormed beaches now walked in silence. But he never lost that spark. Every day he plotted escape, studied guards, watched the routines. His mind was a battlefield of patience and rebellion. In September 1944, he made his move. Along with a few other officers, he crawled under a wire fence in the dead of night, using stolen tin cans to dig a narrow tunnel. Rain soaked the ground, dogs barked in the distance, but he kept going. When they finally slipped out, they vanished into the dark German countryside. For days, they moved quietly through forests and farms, surviving on stolen vegetables, sleeping under trees, hunted like animals. After hundreds of miles on foot, Churchill reached the Baltic coast, hoping to find Allied lines. But luck turned again. He was captured once more by a German patrol. This time, he was sent to Tyrol in Austria, along with other high-value prisoners, generals, politicians, and spies. They were guarded by SS troops under orders to execute them if the Allies got too close. It should have been the end of his story. But fate intervened again. As the war neared its end in May 1945, the German guards deserted their posts. The prisoners woke to silence. The gates were open. Without hesitation, Jack Churchill grabbed his few belongings, walked out, and started heading west. He trekked 150 miles across the Alps until he met an American armored column. When they saw him, dirty, limping, carrying a sword, they couldn't believe their eyes. He smiled and said, "I'm Major Churchill, British Army. Glad to see you, chaps." For most men, that would have been enough. They would have gone home, written memoirs, lived quietly. But not Jack Churchill. He wasn't built for peace. He requested to be sent to Burma to continue fighting against Japan. By the time he arrived, though, the atomic bombs had ended the war. When he heard the news, he reportedly sighed and said, "If it wasn't for those damn Yanks, we could have kept the war going another 10 years. That was his spirit. Restless, relentless, made for battle. War didn't make him a soldier. It simply gave him a stage to live as he believed, with courage, style, and music. After the war, Churchill continued to serve, stationed in British-occupied Palestine. Even there, he carried his sword, earning curious looks from younger soldiers who only knew war through rifles and radio commands. Once, when a convoy was ambushed, he calmly directed return fire, standing exposed on the road, his blade flashing in the sunlight. To him, fear was a choice, and he refused to make it. His men told stories about him in whispers, how he walked calmly through sniper fire, how he quoted poetry in battle, how he played the pipes after every victory, no matter how small. To the modern soldier, he was a relic, but to anyone who truly understood war, he was its purest form. By the late 1940s, he finally retired, though retirement for Jack Churchill didn't mean silence. He took up surfing, of all things, becoming one of the first men to ride waves off the coast of England. The man who once charged with a sword through gunfire now rode the ocean with the same fearlessness. People who met him said he laughed loudly, lived fully, and never once regretted how he fought. But deep down, you could tell, he missed the chaos. He missed the sound of the pipes echoing through fog, the weight of his sword, the feeling of standing between order and oblivion. Because that was where he belonged, in the storm. Even decades later, when journalists asked him if he'd ever been afraid, he only smiled and said, "I was too busy fighting to be scared." That was Jack Churchill. Mad to some, heroic to others. But to anyone who's ever faced fear and refused to kneel, he was proof that courage isn't about sanity. It's about heart. Years after the world stopped burning, when the smoke of war faded into history books and medals began to gather dust, Jack Churchill remained a symbol of something timeless, the kind of courage that doesn't fit in manuals or training drills. The war had ended, but the legend of Mad Jack had only just begun. People whispered about him in pubs and barracks across Britain, his name becoming half fact, half myth. They said he fought with a longbow, that he played bagpipes while bullets flew, that he captured an entire German platoon with a sword. And the best part was, every single story was true. Even in peacetime, he walked like a man who still heard distant drums. His back was straight, his eyes sharp, his smile just a little too wild. The world around him had changed. Jet planes roared over cities, soldiers carried assault rifles instead of bayonets, and nuclear bombs loomed as the new weapon of fear. But Churchill didn't belong to that modern age. He belonged to the sound of steel and wind, to the rhythm of pipes echoing through the highlands, to the era when courage meant facing death with a grin. After retiring from the army, he took a post as an instructor at the military school in Surrey. The younger officers adored him, though most thought he was completely mad. He would walk into lectures carrying his sword, wearing his kilt, and start his lessons not with military strategy, but with a tune from his bagpipes. "Gentlemen," he would say, "you may learn to fight with machines, but never forget, it's the man, not the metal, that wins wars." His words stuck. Even those who thought him eccentric couldn't deny the truth buried inside them. He was proof that spirit could be stronger than technology. In an era obsessed with progress, Jack Churchill reminded people that bravery, honor, and individuality were worth more than any weapon. Outside of the classroom, he lived as freely as he had fought, He became a wanderer of sorts, surfing in Cornwall, traveling the Scottish Highlands, and occasionally showing up unannounced at old regimental gatherings. Whenever someone mentioned his wartime exploits, he'd shrug it off with humor. "I was just doing my job," he'd say. But everyone knew his job had been extraordinary. One of his favorite pastimes was sailing. He'd take his small boat out into the English Channel, alone for hours, chasing the wind. Sometimes local fishermen would spot him standing on the deck, hair whipping in the sea breeze, playing his bagpipes into the horizon. They said it was haunting, the sight of that lone figure, pipes crying out across the waves, as if calling to ghosts of men long gone. Those who served under him never forgot him. Letters, stories, and memories passed down through families. Veterans would tell their grandchildren about the day they followed a man with a sword through machine gun fire and lived to tell the tale. They'd describe the sound of bagpipes cutting through chaos, the insane calmness in his voice, the way fear seemed to die whenever he smiled. There was something magnetic about him, not just his courage, but his refusal to conform. He didn't fight because he loved war. He fought because he believed that courage was sacred, that honor mattered even when the world lost its mind. In that way, he became something rare, a warrior philosopher. One night during an interview years later, a journalist asked him if he ever felt out of place carrying ancient weapons into a modern war. Jack paused, his eyes glinting like steel under candlelight, and said, "Every man fights with what makes him feel alive. Mine just happened to be sharper than most." The journalist didn't know what to say, because in that single line he had summed up an entire life, a life lived on his own terms. In the 1950s, when he worked as a military instructor in Australia, his legend followed him across oceans. Local newspapers called him the last true knight. Once, when a group of cadets laughed at his sword, he challenged them to a mock duel and disarmed them all within minutes. The laughter died quickly after that. He wasn't just talk. He was skill, experience, and attitude combined. Even as age crept in, he refused to slow down. When most men his age settled into quiet homes, he was still traveling, still hiking, still telling stories that sounded too impossible to be true, yet always were. He once attended a regimental reunion dressed in full Scottish attire, claymore at his hip, pipes on his back. When someone asked if he'd ever hang up his sword, he laughed and said, "Not until they hang me up first." In the 1960s, he was seen surfing on the south coast of England, his gray hair glinting in the sun, balancing effortlessly on the board. The locals called him the surfing soldier. When asked why he did it, he said, "Because it reminds me that the sea, like war, only respects the fearless." Outside of the classroom, he lived as freely as he had fought. He became a wanderer of sorts, surfing in Cornwall, traveling the Scottish Highlands, and occasionally showing up unannounced at old regimental gatherings. Whenever someone mentioned his wartime exploits, he'd shrug it off with humor. "I was just doing my job," he'd say. But everyone knew his job had been extraordinary. One of his favorite pastimes was sailing. He'd take his small boat out into the English Channel, alone for hours, chasing the wind. Sometimes local fishermen would spot him standing on the deck, hair whipping in the sea breeze, playing his bagpipes into the horizon. They said it was haunting, the sight of that lone figure, pipes crying out across the waves, as if calling to ghosts of men long gone. Those who served under him never forgot him. Letters, stories, and memories passed down through families. Veterans would tell their grandchildren about the day they followed a man with a sword through machine gun fire and lived to tell the tale. They'd describe the sound of bagpipes cutting through chaos, the insane calmness in his voice, the way fear seemed to die whenever he smiled. There was something magnetic about him, not just his courage, but his refusal to conform. He didn't fight because he loved war. He fought because he believed that courage was sacred, that honor mattered even when the world lost its mind. In that way, he became something rare, a warrior philosopher. One night, during an interview years later, a journalist asked him if he ever felt out of place carrying ancient weapons into a modern war. Jack paused, his eyes glinting like steel under candlelight, and said, "Every man fights with what makes him feel alive. Mine just happened to be sharper than most." The journalist didn't know what to say, because in that single line, he had summed up an entire life, a life lived on his own terms. In the 1950s, when he worked as a military instructor in Australia, his legend followed him across oceans. Local newspapers called him the last true knight. Once, when a group of cadets laughed at his sword, he challenged them to a mock duel and disarmed them all within minutes. The laughter died quickly after that. He wasn't just talk, he was skill, experience, and attitude. Even as age crept in, he refused to slow down. When most men his age settled into quiet homes, he was still traveling, still hiking, still telling stories that sounded too impossible to be true, yet always were. He once attended a regimental reunion dressed in full Scottish attire, claymore at his hip, pipes on his back. When someone asked if he'd ever hang up his sword, he laughed and said, "Not until they hang me up first." In the 1960s, he was seen surfing on the south coast of England, his gray hair glinting in the sun, balancing effortlessly on the board. The locals called him the surfing soldier. When asked why he did it, he said, "Because it reminds me that the sea, like war, only respects the fearless." But behind the wild grin and the jokes, there was depth, the kind that comes only from seeing life and death too closely. He carried ghosts with him, like all soldiers do. The difference was he made peace with them. He honored them with every tune he played on his pipes, every quiet smile, every act of courage in the small moments of life. As the decades passed, the world slowly forgot the individual heroes of World War II. The focus shifted to armies, nations, and strategies. But a few names refused to fade. Names like Jack Churchill, whose story was too strange and too powerful to be forgotten. By the 1980s, he had become a quiet old man living in Surrey, still sharp, still stubborn. He'd take evening walks with his sword, waving to neighbors who couldn't believe what they were seeing. Children whispered that he was a knight. Adults whispered that he was crazy. Jack never corrected either of them. Maybe he was both. He lived until 1996, reaching the age of 89, long enough to see the world turn digital, long enough to see the sons of his fellow soldiers grow old. When he passed away, Britain didn't just lose a veteran. It lost a piece of history, the last echo of a time when war was fought with grit and soul, not just machines and numbers. At his funeral, the bagpipes played one final tune, the same melody he had played on the beaches of Norway, the same song that had drifted across the battlefields of France. The notes rose and fell like waves, and for those who knew him, it felt like he was still leading one last charge. Jack Churchill's story remains one of the most extraordinary tales in military history. A man who fought the most mechanized war in human history with weapons